One of the first things you notice when you step inside the oldest house is the absence of modern technology. The Federal Bureau of Control is notably reliant on dated and analog tech. In fact, their technology is at least 20 years past its prime, with the vast majority being 40 plus. So, why does the FBC rely on such obsolete tech? It's an interesting question, and it's one that we can mostly piece together an answer to. Lucky us. So diving headfirst into in-game documentation and lore, we have the first piece of correspondence you'll ever come across in-game. The prohibited items reminder found in the lobby lists several items and materials that aren't allowed inside of the oldest house. These banned items fall into, well, 3 distinct categories: modern tech, archetypal items, and the, well, obvious. Unauthorized weapons being banned is pretty self-explanatory, so I'm going to move straight along to archetypal items. Now, that might seem a little backwards to some of you, but context is key. Before we go tackling the issue of modern tech, we first need to grasp the fundamentals. We need to understand the nature of altered items, objects of power, and the influence our collective unconscious has on them both. For those who are unaware, the collective unconscious was a concept coined by psychoanalyst Carl Jung. The easiest way to think of it is as a library of inherited shared knowledge and mental concepts that connects all of humanity universally, irrespective of when and where. They're ideas that we just seem to innately understand, and it explains why certain motifs, symbols, and themes, archetypal concepts, repeat throughout various time periods and cultures, in our art, mythology, and stories. Control combines this idea with a more standard definition of an archetype, a perfect example of something containing the most important characteristics of it. An iconic depiction. It's what we visualize in our minds when we're asked to think about a certain object or item. If I asked you to imagine a classic haunted house, a large proportion of you would probably picture something similar to this. This is entirely down to this depiction entering the popular culture during the 20th century, thanks to its usage in various pieces of media, as well as the growth in the popularity of Halloween. Through this widespread exposure and propagation of an idea, this image was adopted by us as the archetype of haunted houses. It's essentially a form of memetics. People who weren't exposed to this idea will likely picture something else. And back at the start of the 20th century, when most of these buildings would have been less than 50 years old and oddly spoopy, this idea would have been non-existent. Instead, the haunted house archetype would have likely been based on the castles and manors from centuries prior. As pointed out in the collective unconscious document, these archetypes are never fixed, but shift and change in tandem with our species and culture. So what does this all mean? And what does this have to do with altered items, objects of power, and the oldest house? Well, to paraphrase a good chunk of Dr. Darling's presentation on altered world events, there's an unknown relationship between the paranatural forces that disturb our reality and our collective unconscious. Paranatural forces gravitate towards archetypal objects, so clearly humanity's collective unconscious, for some unknown reason, influences and affects the likelihood of an object being used by them. That being said, it's still something that we don't fully understand, and it's largely out of our control. In a nutshell, it means that exposing archetypal objects to paranatural forces, active AWEs, or places of power, which the oldest house is, would be an extraordinarily bad idea. It would be like taking a lighter to a fireworks factory. The chance of something going wrong is just stupidly high, likely ending up with the creation of a new altered item. An item that would be at best unpredictable, and at worst, deadly. The FBC would hardly waste money creating posters like these if it wasn't a legitimate concern. Aside from that, we have proof of it previously happening. The rubber ducky altered item, for example, was somehow created when an FBC agent illegally took home paranatural materials. So with all that in mind, it's completely understandable why the FBC would place a blanket ban on all archetypal items, including the explicitly mentioned number 2 pencil, or HB pencil for us non-American peeps. Knowledge of their archetypal depictions are just too prevalent in our collective unconscious. It means that bringing them inside the building would be a liability, and the Bureau just doesn't want to chance it, which, I mean, is fair. Getting back to the main topic of this video, why modern tech is both absent and straight up banned from the oldest house, the collective unconscious also plays a major role in that too. This is explained to us more in depth in a note on the technological limitations of the oldest house. Being based out of the oldest house imposes numerous restrictions on the FBC, due to the building's nature as a place of power. A direct side effect of this is the inability to use modern tech inside the building. Unlike with archetypal items, which are high risk due to the possibility of the unintentional creation of altered items, modern tech in this regard is inert and safe. They're not known to become altered. Instead, the reasoning for their restriction is due to the financial burden and chance of physical injury they pose. Modern tech either breaks or vanishes inside the building, which would be a constant drain on Bureau resources. Plus, I doubt many staff members would be happy with their shiny new phones vanishing off into the ether. Or blowing up worse than a bad take on Twitter. The theory behind why this occurs is that the tech is just too new in our cultural awareness. It hasn't fully entered our collective unconscious yet, so there's no universal understanding of the concept. Therefore, the oldest house just doesn't recognize it, and this leads to unintended side effects and general weirdness. In the Art and Making of Control book, which, by the way, is a fantastic read, this is briefly explored in the section on outdated technology. An example of a chair is used to illustrate this point quite well. Chairs as a concept are nearly universally understood by humanity. If you were to take an image of a chair to various places throughout the world, regardless of its form, people would still mostly recognize it and understand its purpose. This is because it has a shared meaning and value. We all conceptually understand it. But the same cannot be said for many pieces of modern tech. Take smartphones, for example. They've only been around for about 14 years. And even now, a huge proportion of the world's population still relies on the older idea of cell phones and mobile phones, ideas which themselves has only been widely adopted by humanity within the past 25 years. On top of that, smartphones nowadays are multiple pieces of tech rolled into one hand-sized item. They're incredibly complex, and that's really the crux of the issue. It means that not only are smartphones defined by other pieces of better understood older technology like cameras or computers, but as an idea, they're currently competing against the more iconic, simplified and well understood cell phones and mobile phones of yesteryear. It's hella messy. And until the concept becomes more fixed, a universal understanding cannot be agreed upon. And that's for just one piece of modern tech. Think about how technology has drastically changed over the past 30 years, thanks to the rise in things like the internet, LCD displays, and the move to digital data storage, to name but a few. And you start to understand why the collective unconscious, and by extension the oldest house, is struggling to keep up. It's an unprecedented amount of change that all largely happened within a single generation. It's mind-boggling. In comparison, the telephone as a concept has remained largely unchanged for close to a century, even with it becoming more and more obsolete to us. Really, it's more important to us now as an idea. In fact, the telephone receiver as an image will live on long after we stop using analog telephones, simply because it is now a symbol with a universally recognizable meaning. It's an ideogram. If you want proof of this, just take a look at your smartphone or an app like Discord, because they still use it to represent the act of calling. That's how ingrained it is in our awareness or collective unconscious, and there are many examples of this happening, both in recent memory and historically. It's meaning built on the legacy of an idea. To wrap this all up as best as I can, the reason why the FBC relies on such outdated technology within the oldest house is quite simple. Older technology is already well understood conceptually. This comprehension is shared en masse throughout our collective unconscious, and it means that the oldest house just gets it. It both recognizes and can make sense of the technology. This makes older tech not only predictable and dependable, but vitally, it gives the Bureau a form of stability, something that is desperately needed in a world as chaotic as Control's. Control's game director Mikhail Kasarina sums up the FBC's logic behind this fairly well. Within the world of Control, humanity has widespread acceptance and an implicit understanding of analog technology. I'm not saying that that's what the Bureau itself thinks is objectively true within this world, but they do believe that there's value in familiarity. And I have to agree with that. In a way, the familiar is the perfect antidote to the unusual. But the Bureau's reliance on the familiar goes way beyond just that. It's also an observation of a habit from within bureaucracy itself, the manifestation of an unwritten rule, a rule that many of the real-world inspirations of the FBC seem to unknowingly follow. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. This is a well-known quirk and criticism of many bureaucratic organizations. They're kind of infamous for their refusal to modernize, relying upon systems, technology, and practices that, whilst familiar and dependable to them, are completely outdated, only currently being used out of convenience and an unwillingness to replace something that already works. Remedy cleverly incorporated this idea into the game's lore by turning it into a rule or even ritual that the Bureau has to observe. I honestly can't think of a better way of embodying this idea. And whilst you might think that this seems like a bit of a stretch by me, you'd be dead wrong. As a matter of fact, a cited inspiration for the Bureau's reliance on obsolete tech was this equally interesting and horrifying piece of trivia. The perfect note to end on. Up until 2019, the United States military still used 8-inch floppy disks to control and coordinate its nuclear forces. 50-year-old tech controlled all of the nukes for the world's second largest nuclear power. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider liking and subscribing. I just quickly want to give a huge thank you to everybody that has recently subscribed or commented on any of my videos. The feedback to the Control videos has been overwhelmingly positive, and honestly, it's just been really lovely. So thank you all. Till next time, later, Spaghetti.